The Cold War mindset is in Delhi, that we are stuck in the old framework while NATO has moved on and is ready to talk. I mean, all we're saying is here, sit down, have an annual consultation.
So we have again this week C. Raja Mohan with us, who is contributing editor of Foreign Affairs for the Indian Express and director at the South Asia Institute at the University of Singapore, the National University of Singapore. As always, we will be discussing his column Raja Mandala. This time it's a bit controversial. He's sort of advocating, which I know in Indian foreign policy circles, as many of us would know, he's advocating that India have closer ties with NATO, engage with NATO as a bloc, as a military alliance, which will raise some eyebrows, I'm sure. So, of course, the piece, you should read the piece. The links will be with the description with this video, wherever you see it. So, sir, the first question is that what you've advocated in this piece is that India has partly from a Cold War hangover and partly because of the colonial legacy, a suspicion of Europe and NATO in particular. And that given our interest in the Indo-Pacific now and the changing nature of geopolitics and where the world is today, that engagement with NATO as a bloc, not joining NATO, of course, they're not asking, you say in the piece, they're not asking and we don't want to.
Yeah.
But just engaging with NATO might be a step forward in terms of terrorism, in terms of our interest in the Indo-Pacific and various other factors. So the first question I have is, why, I mean, the idea of NATO is essentially a Cold War construct, created back in the day against the Eastern Bloc. It was America and Western Europe's alliance. You point out in the piece how there are it's not like all the NATO states are on the same page, even about things like Russia and perhaps even China. Is it worth the investment and this thing to take an alliance, to engage with an alliance whose time also may have passed, where we have more and more bilateral relationships and multilateral relationships with Europe?
Yeah, I mean, you're right about the Cold War. The NATO was the most prominent Cold War military alliance that was built in Western Europe in partnership with the US, and Russia had its Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact got dissolved after the Soviet Union disappeared, but the NATO has continued. But we're not in the Cold War today. The fact is, after the Cold War, NATO has engaged Russia. So NATO and Russia have a formal engagement, though right now they have tensions between them. NATO has also engaged China. So they have a relationship. So when NATO was looking at the post-Cold War world, they said, look, we need to engage everyone, expand the partnerships with neutral, non-aligned states, as well as China and Russia. So for India not to engage, they're not asking you, as you rightly said, for membership. We're not interested in membership. They're just saying, look, we want to engage you, have regular consultations. But it's one of those residual, the Cold War is in Delhi, the Cold War mindset is in Delhi, that we are stuck in the old framework while NATO has moved on and is ready to talk. I mean, all we're saying is here, sit down, have an annual consultation. Don't forget, after the Cold War, NATO has come closer to us. They've been in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. They were in Iraq, they were in Libya. Not a great record there. So they're looking today to do what can they contribute to Asian security in the Indo-Pacific. So that's a basis on which to talk to them. Maybe we will not find a common ground, but there's no harm in talking. And I think it is the reluctance to talk, even to sit down with them, which is kind of very surprising given the big changes that we've done in our foreign policy over the last 2 decades.
So the second thing, I mean, you bring it up in your piece, but I'd like to ask it again in a little more detail, is that both China and Russia have tensions with the US in particular right now, and it's differing kinds of tension, like this. So Germany may want to talk to Russia at one point while the US doesn't, and it's one thing to have bilateral relations, which, like you point out, that Russia and China have both been, I mean, they're also nation states. They know we have our independent foreign policy. And Russia is the big fear, because we still have a lot of trade and defense ties with Russia. Isn't NATO, because NATO was primarily a military alliance, do you think that kind of signal that if even say you have an annual meet with NATO, and things go really south with Russia, which is always a possibility, or China for that matter, is that the old non-aligned hangover, you can call it, but that fear that if we put too many eggs in one basket, especially with something like NATO, which still has a sort of residual symbolic fear that, you're essentially going on the US camp out and out. Do you think that, I mean, how would you address that fear?
Look, the Russians are already upset with you. I mean, they have a problem with what you do with the United States. they have a problem with the Quad, that doesn't mean they stop engaging with you. So while we're directly dealing with the US, to have an extra conversation with NATO is really about, we're talking to the Europeans. We already have a channel with the Americans. Now we have the Quad. The idea for us to engage NATO is really to reach out to the 30 countries. I mean, other than the US, there are 29, to reach out to them and engage them, their military establishments. It's a one-shop window for you, to one window shopping for you, that you can reach out to them. So I think Russians are practical, just like us. Look, they have a relationship with China, with which we are in a territorial conflict. We have a serious problem on our borders. That doesn't mean Russia is going to abandon its relationship with China. So they know that, look, they need to separate the India relationship. They value the India relationship. So they have things with the US, problems. They have a partnership with China. So they're trying to manage the India relationship. Similarly, us, as we expand our engagement with the US and more broadly with NATO, we still want to keep the Russia relationship intact. And we're not the only ones. As you mentioned, Germany. Americans are threatening sanctions on us with the, for S-400. There's even a bigger threat to the Germany, which is into the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which Russian gas is coming in. So I think these problems will always be there. So foreign policy is about not having this pure constructs, but actually managing the real world complexities. And just as in life, so in foreign policy, our friends have problems with our other friends. That is where we have to deal with that, rather than saying, look, because of Russia, I won't deal with NATO, because Russia itself is dealing with NATO. Russia has not stopped engaging with Europe just because there's NATO. Because Russians can say, look, where the hell is that NATO? Because Warsaw Pact has collapsed. What are you doing here? But they talk to the NATO. So I think we should not be so obsessed with this, that because NATO is a military alliance, we won't talk to them. We are doing bigger stuff with the Americans. What we're likely to do with NATO is likely to be much smaller. But it's a conversation we have.
So then the final question I have, which is the broader question, this comes up in a lot of your columns, including this one. There seems to be, say, even with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and to a greater extent with Prime Minister Modi, you're changing certain parameters. The way he engaged with the Middle East was one. Now, with Europe, with America, expanding cooperation. And then there's the establishment, the foreign policy establishment, the mandarins in the ministry. To what extent is that conflict, or that sort of this, do you think that this sort of hangover from both, like we said before, the colonial era, the non-aligned movement, the Cold War, how do you think, to what extent that's holding back Indian policy, or not holding back, but slowing down certain bold moves that could be made?
I think there's no better example than the US relationship. I mean, we started, say, 1998, the US imposed sanctions. We had a long history before that of US relationship with Pakistan. Clinton administration was talking about activism in Kashmir. So when Bush came and said, look, no, I want to have a better relationship with India, I mean, people were deeply suspicious. The political class, the bureaucratic establishment, and the foreign policy elite. And that's the reason why Manmohan Singh, who said, George Bush, I love you.
Yeah.
He understood the value of the nuclear deal. But he couldn't convince Sonia Gandhi and Rahul Gandhi about the merits of it. The left walked out of the coalition, UPA won. He had to go to the parliament to get a no confidence vote. So the trouble we went through for a fairly straightforward, that we put some reactors under safeguards, we get access to international market. We haven't bought a single reactor from the US. But if you go back to revisit that debate, I mean, it's as if India was going to be finished by this one nuclear deal. India is going to be sold out. It's going to lose its independent foreign policy. So the exaggeration of the problems when we come to deal with the US, if Russians had given us the deal, because they didn't have the power to get the others to accept it, would anybody have raised a question? No. So I think the trust building with the West, with the US in particular, took a long time. But today, when we sit in the Quad, is anybody raising objections? No. So I think people are, by inertia, institutional lag, it's always there. And that's where the difference between Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was eager to build a relationship with the US, but could not carry his party. Well, Prime Minister Modi, as a strong leader, is pushing this forward, and is forcing the pace of India's engagement with the rest of the world. And I think that is the change. And I think just as Rajiv Gandhi could do things, Indira Gandhi could do things, Jawaharlal Nehru could do things, they overcame a lot of the resistance. Just one example, in India, when India wanted to buy MiG-21 from the Russians, here was the Indian military establishment brought up on British equipment. There was huge resistance to buying Russian. But Nehru decided, no, we're going to do it. So I think that's where leadership comes in. And we've seen that the acceleration of change, while many were initiated under Manmohan Singh, a lot of them have gained fruition under Modi because of the stronger position that the current Prime Minister is in domestically.
So just as a small follow-up, that I mean, essentially, if you have the mandate, if the political mandate does help overcome bureaucratic inertia to a large extent. I mean, I mean, the difference between Modi and Manmohan Singh would have been that to a large extent. Okay, sir, thanks a lot.